Hi everybody, my name's Tony Bree, I'm with MetricStream, and I appreciate everybody coming here. It's our third-party risk. I think this is our fourth session on third-party risk. Today's successful strategies in the post-onboarding phase. And I'm going to turn it over to Nandini. She's a business analyst for us in MetricStream. Just one thing that you'll know, just like all the other decks, these decks will be available on the website, I believe, starting tomorrow. So, but if you have any questions, we'd like to have everybody interact as we do this, and feel free to not only come up to ask questions now, but also after the session. So with that, Nandini.
Thanks, Tony. So, today we will talk about the third-party risk. As you can see the title, the successful strategies in the post-onboarding phase. So, this is the phase where when it starts once the organization sign the contract with the vendors or the third parties. So, this is the ongoing phase that we will talk about and how to manage it effectively. So, if we consider different industries, be it manufacturing, IT, pharma or the retail, the frequency at which the suppliers or the third parties get added into the system may vary. For example, in manufacturing it might not happen at a very often rate, but at the same time if you consider retail industry, the suppliers might get added into the system, let's say every month, because there is a very low switching cost and the consumers would want to change the suppliers every now and then. So, be it any industry, irrespective of any industry that we consider, the one thing that is common is that once you hire your vendors or third parties, you need to monitor them. So, the ongoing phase becomes common across the industries. So, with that note, let us get started with the session. So, this is the agenda I have for the session. So, we will start with defining the third parties, the vendors, and how it is impacting the business models across the world. And also we will try to understand what are the main challenges the organizations face when it comes to handling the vendor risk, and what are the reasons for those challenges. So, once we have the problem, we have understood the problem, we will look at a step-by-step methodology or approach to tackle those problems with respect to the vendor risk. So, this would be my first part of the session. In the second part of the session, we will move on to see some of the interesting case studies which talk about how they successfully implemented the methodology that we will look at in the session. So, finally, I have the top 3 takeaways for the organizations who would want to move into the vendor risk, or also who would want to improvise what they have already in the system. Okay, globalization and vendor risk. We all know that in today's world, in order to keep up with the growing business needs and customer expectations, it is very difficult to manage all the needs by a single organization. It has to rely on the third parties, the vendors, etc. So, what are the third parties? The third parties are nothing but you can say your service side partners, your demand side partners, your let's say it could be your contractors. So, anybody, any individual or a company who has a business relationship or the contract with you and who is providing you some kind of service or the product becomes a third party. So, this model where the organizations relying on the third party for some of their activities has also worked out well, given that the outcome that we achieve could be quicker, cheaper and better. But this also arises one question that has this invited us into a whole new world of risk? So, we will try to answer to this question by looking at some of the incidents that have happened in the past. So, in 2012, a major credit card giant had to pay around $60 million as penalty. So, this was considered one of the biggest penalty in the history until we had recently in 2013 about the retail incident. So, here the reason was simple. So, this credit card company had outsourced the telemarketing services to the third party, and they had involved in the illegal card practices, which actually got the credit card company into trouble. And the second one happened at a major hospital. So, this is also an interesting example where one of the IT vendor they had hired, their computer system was breached, and which led the 6,800 individuals data, the EPHI, electronically protected health information, which has to be kept confidential according to the HIPAA regulation. So that went public, and this was a huge violation according to the HIPAA regulation, and the hospital got into trouble. And the third one, which happened to a major home renovation company, where they failed to produce the third party certification, because they had hired a vendor to paint the houses in USA, and that paint had contained lead in it, which is again a violation according to the EPA, Environment Protection Agency. So again they had to fine the home renovation. So like this, there are umpteen number of examples. So if we take a closer look at these examples, and actually we will see that all these companies had due diligence and the screening process in place before they hired the contracts. So what went wrong later? And why the vendors slipped through the crack? How did the organization fail to notice that potential risk? There could be multiple reasons, but the main reasons that we can look at is the mutual understanding between a third party and the organization is very much important, but it's very risky to assume that everything will go as per the plan. And this especially happens in the long-term contracts, where the organizations who are working with the vendors, like let's say for 10-15 years, they actually become complacent, saying that since I have been working with this vendor, no need to bother. The third could be that in yesterday's session, Michael was mentioning the rate at which the regulatory bodies are changing. The OCC came up with a new section last year, and FFIC added one more rule to its regulations. So the organizations find it a big challenge to keep up the pace with those regulations, and also how to change the current process and the software that they have. And the fourth and the most important challenge when it comes to handling the vendor risk on ongoing basis is that the third parties, the organization that they have hired, are in turn growing. They are in turn outsourcing their services and the products to fourth parties, the fifth parties. So how the organizations will get the visibility across the chain? So that's again a biggest challenge. So with all these points, the point that we can try to focus on is that the due diligence and the screening process, we all know that it is very important, and it is kind of given that we do that. But the major challenge or the discipline that we need to have is the ongoing monitoring phase. Once you sign the contract, you need to have a certain process in place so that you don't get into trouble. So in today's session, we will see that how we can effectively manage, and the simple approach that we can follow. So that was about my first part of the session. So let me know if we have any questions, or I can continue with the methodology.
Anybody have any questions? I'll run out with the mic too. Make it easy for everyone.
Okay, so I'll move on to the methodology. So this methodology, what we can think of is a kind of a simple approach to make this ongoing monitoring very simple to use and yet very intelligent. So we will look at the 4 steps. First is to centralize, second is to stratify, third is to automate, and fourth is to predict. So these, in the session, we will talk about each of these steps in detail and how can we achieve them for the organization which wants to start from the scratch about the vendor risk management. Centralize. So this steps basically talks about how you bring all your vendors under one hood. It's a very interesting quote that I would like to mention here, that one of the compliance risk officer mentioned that if somebody were to ask, how many vendors you have in your organization, apparently this is one of the toughest question to answer. So we will look at that, how we can simplify this and why this became a tough question to answer at the first place. So the first step towards that is identify all your vendors, be it big, small, or even those who are coming from your mergers and acquisition. Identify all of them. The second one is move away from your traditional way of managing the vendors. If you are managing through the spreadsheets or the macros or emails or documents, please move away, because it's not going to work out in the long run if you have a huge vendor base. The third one is, once we have these two steps, we have identified all the vendors, and we have also identified a software which can take all these vendors, we can load all these vendors. So now we have a complete picture of all the vendors, and this will in turn will also avoid any anomalies that we have. It so happens that HR department would have hired one vendor, and the same vendor would have been hired by the procurement department. So there is a redundancy, kind of redundancy. So once we have the complete list in the system, we will come to know that, okay, this guy is a redundant and the same vendor, so we will have only one entry to that vendor. So all these kind of anomalies we can remove once we move away from the traditional way of managing them. So the second step is to stratify. Stratify is nothing but how you segment your vendors. So we all know that the 80-20 rule. So the 80% of your dollar amount is spent on the 20% of your vendors, but at the same time 20% of your work is done by the 80% of your vendors. So we need to focus on those 20 prime and critical vendors for our organization. So the question arises that how do I do that? How do I know that they are critical to my organization? The first step towards that is profile the vendors. There could be multiple critical factors according to your business. One could be that the one that we just spoke about, spend, how much you are spending on them. So there could also be a factor that what will happen to your business if your vendor or the third party runs out of the business. So what is the impact on your business? And the third could be like any relevant factors that you can think of, or it makes sense to your business or organization. Based on that, you identify what are my critical vendors and what are my priority or medium critical vendors. So come up with the taxonomy. Second is to have a evaluation mechanism. In the first step what we did was we have categorized, okay, these are my critical and these are my non-critical and these are my not so important vendors. So the second step what we are doing is we need to craft surveys or questionnaires where we will decide that, okay, I want to analyze or evaluate my critical vendors by 3 types of assessments. First is I will send out the questionnaire to the third party. Second is once I have the response, I'll also get it reviewed by my departments. Based on the responses, I will get it reviewed by the legal team, the information security team, if they are providing any the data services, or the IT, if they are hosting any cloud or the data centers on my behalf. So I'll also get it reviewed by my internal experts. And third, I'll also go and visit the vendor premises. So what I'm doing is looking at the criticality of the vendor, I am assigning the evaluation mechanism. So that happens in this step. And it could be your different evaluations, financial could be one of the factor. It could be that country risk, what countries they are coming in, and it could be your reputational, branding risk. So all those factors which are important to your business, you define them and evaluate and come up with the questionnaire. Third is deciding the frequency. So in this step what you are doing is you are saying that, okay, at what interval I need to analyze this. So for my mission critical and a very, very high risk vendor, let's say I want to monitor them, let's say every month, but at the same time a low risk profile vendor and who is not so important for who is just providing me a stationery, pen and notebooks for my company, I don't want to monitor them, let's say every month, I can monitor them once in a year. So you define the interval. So you have profiled the vendors, you know what to evaluate, and in here you have answered the question how often to evaluate. Okay, so the third step talks about actually stitching the first and the second step together. So in the first one what we have done is we have a list of vendors who are centralized, and in the second step we have segmented them and we have also have the evaluation mechanism. The third step what it is doing is with the help of some risk algorithm or a process, it is bringing these two steps together. So because if you look at the end of the second step, the kind of evaluation assessments that you are going to have, it is going to be a very tedious task for anybody to manage the vendors on in a manual effort. So what you need to do is you need to automate this process as much as possible. So let's see how we can do that. So the first step towards is that use a risk algorithm. So it need not be, as the name says, it need not be a complex. It can be a very simple and easy to use risk algorithm. So this risk algorithm, it is not doing anything, but it is just putting the different vendors into different risk buckets. Let's say I have 3 buckets: high risk bucket, low risk bucket, medium risk bucket. So this algorithm, based on the scoring and the way the supplier or the third party responds, it gets calculated and the range is given. Based on that range, the buckets are calculated for all the vendors.
Okay, before we go on, I just want to also mention, it's not only by vendor, but it also could be by the product or the service that that vendor does. How many do that right now? A show of hands. Yeah, what we found is even more so that it is becoming increasingly important, especially from the regulator's eyes, that you can have a vendor that is critical in one area and not critical in another area, but they want to see your planning and your process on how you deduce why they are for that specific product or service. And then what also is going on now too in this area is that, and I know we've been working on this too, is we're trying to come up with a way to get a FICO score for a vendor. And it's something that I know the regulators kind of are looking at, and we've talked to them about this, and it's something that's continuing to evolve. So I'll keep you posted on that, but it's something that I think definitely that's where we're going.
Yeah. So as I was saying, that in this step you have all the evaluation criteria and the mechanism in place. So you just map them, that okay, for this my risk bucket, this is the kind of evaluation I want to trigger, and the system should take care. And the third is to repeat this process. So this is a kind of a cyclical way. So you first step is to you assess the vendors and put them into different buckets, and based on those buckets the assessments and the evaluation get triggered, and also the frequencies get decided. And based on the recent response, let's say last month the high risk vendor had responded that they don't have any information security certification in place, but this month they apparently got the certification. So automatically the risk level has gone down, the risk bucket has changed. So now the frequency has changed from 1 month to, let's say, 2 months. Every 2 months you want to monitor that particular vendor. So this is a continuous and a cyclical process where you will have to keep doing this until the vendor stays in your system, until you offboard or stop using the service or the product from that particular third party. Okay, so the first 3 steps, the first is to centralize, stratify, and third one is to automate. So they just talk about how you can make the ongoing process simple. So this step basically talks about how you can bring the intelligence into your vendor management. So this step basically telling the organization that you need to be a step ahead in assessing the potential risk, what the vendors can bring to your organizations, because it is too late that it comes up in the headline saying that you really have a bad supplier. So that's too late for us to take any action, or only the corrective action is possible, but we cannot think of any prevention there. So let's see how we can do that in this step. Make use of your leading indicators. So define your KPIs and KRIs. So the key performance indicator and key risk indicator. So the quantitative indicators that I can think of is like, let's say credit worthiness of your vendor, or the debt to equity ratio of your supplier. So all these are available right there, in the publicly available data like Dow Jones, the S&P websites, etc. So make use of that data and define your KPIs and KRIs and set the threshold. Okay. So you can also define KPIs and KRIs for some of the quantitative factors, like the geographical risk or the strategic risk or third party can bring in. Next is to spot the trouble. So we know that we have defined the KPIs and the KRIs. We have also attached the thresholds for them. So whenever there is a breach of this threshold, we know that it kind of gives an early signal or warning to us that we need to take action on that, because something is going wrong at the vendor. So you need to be, you will be appraised about that. So in this step, you actually take the action. So here a very interesting the scenario that we can think of in an ideal vendor management, intelligent vendor management solution, where let's say you have hired a third party and who is opening up a store in an area or a location where the crime rates and the drug trafficking is at a very high rate. Okay, so that you have defined as geographical risk as one of your KPIs or KRIs. So this KRI is been mapped to a on-site visit type of assessment. So whenever there is a breach, it is notifying the supplier risk manager or the compliance officer saying that you need to go and visit the vendor premises in order to see the potential risk. So this has gone to an extent that depending on the risk that you are looking at, the type of the assessment the system is telling you. Because at that case, the self-assessment questionnaire that you send to the supplier will not work, because this is related to a geographical risk. You need to go and see what is going on. So that was about the methodology, and from, as I said in the beginning, in the remainder section of the presentation of the session, we will talk about the case studies that have actually implemented this methodology that we spoke about all this while. So let me know if there are any questions, or we can move on to the case studies.
Can you show us how Dow Jones is integrated with MetricStream?
Yes, I can show that at the end of the session. So we'll get started with the case studies. So as I said, the first case study I have picked up is about a financial service company who has 2,800 vendors spread across 20 different locations. So also each of this case study talk about different characteristic of the GRC solution. So the first one talks about how the company and the GRC solution itself evolved over the years. So this company went live in 2013, and all they wanted to achieve from a vendor management solution is to manage the huge vendor base and be compliant with OCC and FFIEC guidelines. But if you look at the current solution that they are using on a daily basis, is that the complete ongoing process has been automated, where they actually could save 1/3 of the manual effort that they used to use in handling the spreadsheets and macro way of handling the vendors. So they could actually manage to have the efficiency in the vendor managing process. And next, so as the requirement was to have the regulatory compliant, they have the reporting structure for any need of the OCC guidelines or any other guidelines. So be it the collection of the artifacts or the documents or the evidences from the vendors, they have the reporting structure. You ask for any certification or the proof from the vendor, they have the reporting structure inbuilt. And the next best practices that we can think of from this particular case study is that the 4th step that we talked about, the prediction element, where they have made the vendor risk management to talk to a metrics module, where the KPIs and KRIs will actually share the data between the vendor risk management, and they get notified on an ongoing basis if there is any breach of the threshold. The second case study talks about the extensibility and flexibility of the GRC solution. So here one of the interesting case study in my opinion is in 2015 the financial data provider, the company on the right hand side, went live with the third party management solution. So in the later year, in the end of the 2015, this company was acquired by Exchanging Network. So the parent company did not have any third party management or vendor management solution in place. So all they wanted to do was that, okay, since we already have the child organizations third party management solution in place, let's start using that. But the challenge was that the screening process with respect to what the child company had already built into the third party management solution was completely different from the exchanging networking company. So they had to redefine this entire process. And also one more challenge that they had was, since they had completed the acquisition very recently, they wanted this process to work with all the vendors, because if we consider these two industries, they are two different industries in their domains. One is into a financial data providing company and another is a exchanging network. So when the domains are different, the kind of third parties or the vendors that you hire will also be different. So they wanted a common screening or ongoing process which will work for all the third parties and all the vendors. So here, as part of this project, what was done was the complete remapping of the screening process was taken care, and this screening process was catered to all the types of the vendors of both the organization, parent and child organization. And also currently they are in the talks of integrating vendor management and the business continuity management. So the idea here is, whenever there is a failure at the vendor side, it automatically triggers the business continuity planning, so that the vendor risk program is not left behind and wait until the failure happens. So it automatically triggers what needs to be done when there is a failure. Yeah, so the third case study talks about the configurability of the GRC solution. How easy it should be when it comes to vendor management, because as we spoke about, everything is changing. The regulations are changing, the vendors are changing, you are going through mergers and acquisitions. There are a lot of things that are changing. So it has to be so simple enough and it should be configurable enough so that you don't keep changing your and customizing your GRC solution. So this is about a multinational retailer. So this retailer had around 900 suppliers spread across 450 different stores across the world. So we also understood in the beginning that in a retail industry, the frequency at which the suppliers get added into the system is very, very high, because there is a low switching cost. So the challenges were that they wanted a vendor management solution which can take care of the ad hoc addition of the suppliers, and this happens at 450 different stores. So the supplier risk manager who is sitting at the organization level, who does not have the visibility, okay, what is going on at my different stores and how do I get the centralized view. So as part of the solution, what we can think of is that in order to take care of the ad hoc addition of the suppliers, you need to automate the onboarding process, or you need to simplify. So every store manager comes to the software and they quickly enter the vendor details and the vendor gets onboarded. So the supplier risk manager who is sitting at the organization level gets the notification, okay, there is a new addition of a supplier that happened at a so and so store. So, and all these stores were created as something like facilities. So these facilities will roll up to give a centralized view to the risk manager, or you can call it as a super store owner, who can see that, okay, what is going on, how many suppliers got added across today and what is their risk profiles. So all this can be rolled up. And the third one is the third party audit. So here, in addition to all this, the retailer also wanted to make sure that the third parties are compliant. So they wanted to have the third party audits and self assessments and the certifications to say that we are not only compliant with all this, but even the suppliers are also compliant. So they wanted all this to be in place as part of the third party management or the supplier governance solution. So those were about the 3 case studies that I had picked up. So in the in the final conclusion part of the session, this is nothing different from what we have been talking about in this last 20-30 minutes. So the first thing is, the due diligence and the screening process is understood that it is important, but then ongoing process has to be in place, because if you looked at the incidents, the companies got into trouble because they did not have the ongoing oversight. The second one is that the vendor risk management or the monitoring of the vendors is going to consume a lot of time, and it is going to be tedious. So we need to automate it wherever possible, so that we save that time to focus on the primary activities which matter to our organization. And the third is, make use of the leading indicators. There are a lot of information available, and there can be a lot of risks that can be identified in our system. So make use of these leading indicators, define your KPIs and KRIs, and catch hold of those potential risks the vendors can bring to your organization and act upon before the crisis happens. So that was all about the third party risk. Let me know if there are any questions.
And before we take some questions, I just wanted to say that one of the key points too is you have to have an audit trail for everything. It's really important to make sure that, and I speak from the financial world, they want audit trails on everything, especially your onboarding, your due diligence, your risk assessments, how you put that all together. They really are digging in. And one of the things I was talking about yesterday is, we used to have a situation where we could work with all these different groups, and everybody would share information, it would be collaborative, and we would really get past a lot of the hurdles that are in the markets today, or challenges today that everybody has. And unfortunately, the industries, the associations, the regulators, whoever, we just don't have that collaboration or sharing idea anymore. And I think if we did get there, it would really help us. And I think because of Dodd-Frank and some other things that are going on, we're going through a transition phase. And usually the financial world is the one that adapts first, and then everybody else after that. I think it's changing. I think that there's multiple dimensions working in the same parallels right now. And I know you have some questions, but I also want to throw things back to you and maybe pick out some people, and also they can give us some of their challenges. But Vicki, did you have a question?
I did. So I just wanted to see, you were talking about some of the vendor self-assessments, and just from our perspective in our company, when the business is working with that vendor, sometimes they want to bring that vendor on really bad. So what controls does the system, or you may suggest, to ensure that that integrity exists, that they are providing the correct information, so that risk and legal and everybody else can make the right call on whether to select that vendor, and then obviously on ongoing process as well?
Yes, so there could be like multiple line of defense that we can have. First could be that you can just send out a self-assessment questionnaire to a supplier where they will provide all the details. So once you have the responses back, you also get it reviewed by your internal subject matter expert, and along with the responding to the questionnaire, make sure that they provide some kind of evidence that, okay, they say that I am handling the information security management really well. Then how do you prove that? So there should be in a application point of view, if you talk about, you need to have the attachment or the artifacts field mandatory, where they have to produce something in order to prove that, okay, you are doing what you are saying. So we can have multiple lines of defense, where we can actually make sure that we have all the evidences and collected about that third party, and we just don't go by what they are saying.
Right, and I guess it would be some sort of system controls to ensure that the business is not able to change any of that information, I guess, once it's collected, right?
Sorry?
So in there, I'm assuming that the system would have some sort of internal controls in place to ensure that the business is not able to change any of the information that the vendor has supplied.
Yeah. So all that can be done. I mean, one more thing that I can think of is that you have collected all the responses back from your suppliers, and it is also reviewed by your internal team. and they are, let's say, they are not quite happy. So you can also go back to the supplier and ask that, here I am not happy with your evidence, so please provide more information. So all this workflow can be built. So that is where the configurability about the process comes into picture. You can have multiple review, multiple addition, and you can also mention that, whatever you have providing the information can be discussed and answered collaboratively within your organization to the third parties, so that what they provide at the first go itself is complete and integrated.
Thank you.
And what also can happen too is, as they answer a question, you could set up contingencies. So if they answer the question yes, 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 then maybe it triggers another survey.
Yes.
And if it says yes, no, no, maybe another survey. So it goes along those lines. And it also, again, it's a go by product, go by service, go by vendor.
And also there are, like, as he was mentioning, this we call something called conditional service setup, where based on the first question the vendor has answered, the remaining questions get decided, and also what additional assets that you want to evaluate gets decided. So all the intelligence can be built in, just that we need to make sure that what we want we are getting out of the solution.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
I'm not sure if you're the right audience, but I'm a little curious how MetricStream themselves as a company manages their third parties. And is, when you get delivered an out-of-the-box application, is that what MetricStream is using? And I'd love to be able to talk with someone about that, to compare practices from a company that's leading the industry through a tool to manage that and their methodology behind it.
Yeah, so we have around 70 to 80% of the customers who are using the out of the box, because even the out of the box solution, as I said, is evolving in what it can cater to and how many customers it can cater to. But at the same time, we also have the customers who have asked for customizations to match their business process. So when I say customization, it will be like, the additional review process that they wanted in the system, or a different questionnaire that they wanted. So when they asked all these customizations in 2013, at that time out of the box was still, these features were in the roadmap. But if we look at now, the out of the box is actually catering to most of the features that the customers have been asking. And the second case study that I talked about, so recently the customer wanted to remap the entire screening process, which the child organization was using for 1 year. So I think that we finished using the out of the box in matter of 3 days. The complete screening process was set up.
I just want to comment on, when we're finishing our implementation phase on this, as Tony knows, and I got it originally about what was required for continuous monitoring, and for me, I see 3 types of that I have to deal with. There's my content feed's going to be providing updated alerts all the time, so whether it's Dow Jones or RDC or any of the other ones. So I know I have to have a plan for responding to a change in the outside world and what to do with that information. And then from there, we had to kind of learn what you were talking about, redeploying the assessments, the questionnaires, and at what frequency, and as a part of something that we hadn't historically been doing, and trying to figure out, based on certain information, what frequency makes sense in certain cases. And then the last part of it, the third issue is when you receive ad hoc updates from that same third party, that same vendor, trying to identify what kind of updated information would they be providing to us that would require, outside of the normal frequency, a redeployment of an assessment. Because when we started, and they actually asked us during the implementation of all the different fields that you have, all these data elements in your universe of your third party, which ones would you want to have, ad hoc triggers of reassessments? And that's been sort of a thought process we're still going through, kind of realizing if all the information in the outside world remains the same, no new events, and I have the same vendor, but now I get an updated billing address, is that enough of a red flag for me to require a reassessment or a change in an ownership or something? It's an ongoing struggle.
Okay, so when it comes to that, the continuous updating of the risk profile of the vendors, it actually starts with the questionnaire. So it need not be from the form level where the name or the contact has been updated and it triggers the assessment. It might not happen at that level. So the point that I was emphasizing was that you have a vendor ABC and you are sending out 10 questionnaires to that vendor, like financial, country risk, reputational, and compliance, information security. So like you have 10 factors to assess on. So let's say last month when you had sent the information security questionnaire to that vendor, he had answered that they have everything in place. They provided the certification and everything. But this month when you sent out that questionnaire and you got back the response, you see that the certification whichever has been attached is actually been expired. So they no longer have that certification in place. So this automatically, the risk score is attached to the answer, whether you have the certification yes or no, whether it is expired yes or no. When you say that it is already expired yes, it automatically increases the risk score. So from 10 it becomes to 30. So that the risk score of 30 puts automatically that vendor into medium risk from a low risk. So in the medium risk, you know that what all additional stuffs you need to do for that medium risk vendor. So this is how the cyclical process happens. It need not be at a field level. Even if you want at the field level where the address is changed, you want to trigger an additional questionnaire, that can be done, where you will add this address information as part of the questionnaire, and whenever there is a change, the system can capture and you trigger the additional query to the supplier. That can be done.
So shared assessments has the BITSIG methodology of managing third-party risk. PCI DSS came out with a white paper saying, it's a 27-page white paper saying this is how you'd manage third-party risk. How much of those best practices are built into your out-of-the-box solution?
Yeah, I would say that those will be the ongoing features. Like whenever the PSI DSS comes up with a feature which we do not have, we try to accommodate that in the roadmap. But having said that, currently the most of the 80 to 90% of the customers whom we are talking about, when we show the out-of-the-box solution that we have, they are 90% they are satisfied. The only customization they would want is that, okay, I need these additional reports, and instead of the field name, I want this change. So this kind of indication that, okay, they are also happy with what out-of-the-box is giving, and out-of-the-box is also kind of in line with what the regulations or what the third parties are talking about, how the third party solution should be. So it's kind of, the collaborative indication that we are getting that, okay, this is sufficing the market need.
And one thing I can say is in our solution, you get shared assessments, you get the big SIG or SIG Life, and we work pretty closely with the shared assessments group. It's something that we want to continue to keep on doing and keep on moving forward with, because we do want to stay with best practices and industry standards. The other thing that we do is we do special interest groups are on our own. We call them MSIGs, that we get everybody involved and we want you to become a part of that. We get roundtable groups. There's also webinar discussions that we try to put together, and we always try to build as much best practices, industry standards into the product. And I think it's important that everybody understands this is a partnership. Everybody has to work together, us as a vendor and yourselves, to really make the product better. And that's how the product does get better. And now also working with different partners that we have and shared assessments. I don't know if you know Tom from shared assessments, but they're really cutting edge themselves. And they do a lot of good work, and a lot of people that use the shared assessments tool or questionnaire in our tool, they found it, even SIG Light works real well for them. Because I think SIG Light is about 180 or 200 questions, where Big SIG is about, I think it's almost 2,000 questions, something like that. Yeah. And trying to get a vendor to answer 20 questions is a lot. So, to get them to answer 180 or 2,000 is a lot. So, and they work best practices and industry standards all the time into those questionnaires. Because I know we wanted to talk about Dow Jones for a second, but anybody else? Did you want to address how Dow Jones feeds in?
Yeah, actually this is not there in this laptop.
No, that's all
The
right.
instance.
We'll talk to you. Basically what we have is we have Dow Jones negative news that feeds into the tool. And what it does is it can monitor all your vendors and tell you exactly what new news is going on with them. And then that news can be deployed to different areas of your organization. So it could go to managers, it can go to executives, it can go laterally, it can go anywhere. And it's constantly 24/7 monitoring about all your different vendors. You upload those names and we go in. What Mark has is he has also something called RDC, which takes it a little bit further with the false positives, right?
Yeah, well, just a comment. I mean, I know Maria had mentioned that you have a variety of different content feeds for this purpose. And we looked at Dow Jones, which is probably more ideal for financial services and things. There's more of an emphasis on that area of risk. We are in a product domain, and we had a high focus on anti-bribery, anti-corruption. So RDC as a partner was recommended for us, and we were working with MetricStream as one of the first clients to build out that interface. And RDC offers an analyst human-in-the-loop review as part of their offering. But I come from a trade background, and we know that there's an issue with false positive alerts. It takes a skill set and a lot of people to wade through the noise to get to what's relevant. So we paid in the service with RDC in the background is they're going to collect all the alerts, and the humans who we work with who understand about us and what we're looking for throw out the noise and only pass the relevant matches back to our users. And that is a really ideal thing. I mentioned this at the other panel. If you're looking at who the people are that are going to use this, who need to know whether this is actually a real match or not. So we like that, and we look forward to adding that extra added value, because that cuts down the amount of effort from our team to process this information and know what to do with it.
Yes.
Is there a way to find the data elements that they provide you, so we can kind of see what
Yeah.
Dow Jones is?
Yeah, Dan, we can give you all that stuff. And we'll make sure, and if I can track down Maria DeVasi, we'll put you two together and she can also explain it more in depth. She is the product manager for Dow Jones. And also we have Dow Jones here, so we can have you meet Dow Jones too.
We use D&B Supply Risk Manager currently to get all of our financial information.
Yes.
That we could possibly drop in and use something for.
Well, there you go. Well, we have,
Yes, the first case study that I talked about, the financial sector, they make use of DNB ratings.
and we have an integration with D&B too. Any other questions, anybody? Well, thank you very much for
Thank
coming.
you.
We really
Thank you all.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.